I'm Dan Slater. I'm the director of the Center for Emerging Democracies at the University of Michigan. Thanks everyone for attending this event. The talk today by Anindita Adhikari entitled Claims, Complaints, and Democratization of the Local State in India. Let me just briefly introduce Anindita and our respondent today, Professor Aiyar. Anindita Adhikari is an assistant professor of social science at the National Law School of India University in Bengalurul. She's a political sociologist whose research interests include social movements, bureaucracies, the politics of welfare provisioning, and democratic deepening. She received her PhD in sociology from Brown University in 2023 and served as a postdoc here at the Center for Emerging Democracies in 2023-24. She has previously worked with the Government of Bihar and the Ministry of Rural Development on employment, social security, and land issues. She co-founded the organization's Social Accountability Forum for Action and Research, SAFAR, in 2022. That works on strengthening transparency and accountability in public service delivery in collaboration with state and national governments and civil society. Her book project examines the effects of rights-based welfare expansion and its effects on local governance and civic action through a comparison between two institutionalized accountability systems in Bihar. Her work has been published in journals such as Development and Change and World Development. So welcome back, Ani. And our respondent today to Ani's talk will be Yamini Aiyar. She is currently Senior Visiting Fellow at the Saxena Center for Contemporary South Asia and the Watson Institute at Brown University. She was the President and Chief Executive of the Center for Policy Research, a leading multidisciplinary think tank in New Delhi from 2017 to 2024. Yamini has published widely both in academic and current affairs journals and newspapers, including The Economist, Foreign Affairs, Journal of Democracy, Indian Express, and The Hindu. She has a regular column in the Hindustan Times and Deccan Herald, two leading mainstream newspapers in India. Her book, Lessons in State Capacity from Delhi Schools, was published in 2024 by Oxford University Press. So as is our practice here, we'll have Ani give her talk, 30 minutes or so. Yamini will have 5-10 minutes or so to respond, but really no strict time pressure. And then we'll open things up to Q&A, and everyone who's available online, you can send your questions in the Q&A function. So without any further ado, Ani, welcome back as it were, and we're looking forward to.
Great, thanks so much, Dan. Good afternoon to everyone in Ann Arbor. I see some familiar names in the list. So hi to everyone from Providence as well, and good evening to those who are joining from India. Thanks so much for joining, and thanks, Dan, for that introduction and for the welcome back, and most importantly for pushing me to do this from halfway across the world so that I continue to keep my eye on the ball and keep working on my manuscript. I'm especially now thrilled to have Yamini here today as a discussant. Yamini has been an interlocutor for many years and traverses similar worlds and of academia, policy, and public action in ways that are extremely unique and rare. And having her discuss this chapter is an absolute privilege. So thank you so much. Zai, could you share the slides, please? And as Dan promised, both Yamini and I talk quite fast, so we'll try and get through a lot and stick to time. So thanks for your patience. Okay, so we can begin with the first one. Great. So until 2 decades ago, the landscape of formal forums for ordinary citizens to make welfare-based claims in India was sparse and largely divided between the ballot and the barricade, as some scholars have put it, and for the few that had the means to persist, the courts. Next, please, Ed. Thanks. So for the state, on the other hand, making the local bureaucracy accountable for public service delivery largely looked like this or this, and you can just go through them quickly, Zaid, so we don't have too much time. Sometimes like this or this, which is mostly bureaucrats looking at things. And it's top down with upper level bureaucrats or political leadership keeping frontline functionaries in check, with occasional opportunities for citizens to be heard by elected and appointed officials. But then things began to change in the early 2000s. And here's a very quick recap of the legislative terrain, which my work engages with. Some of you on today are very familiar with this, so I'll go through it quickly. The first wave of major rights-based social policy expansion in India came with the introduction of several national legislations between 2005 and 13 that extended social and economic rights, including employment, food security, and primary education to over 80 crore people, and a universal right to ask for information. The distinctive feature of these laws was not just the legal entitlement to material benefits, but its commitment to delivering welfare in a manner that is transparent, accountable, and participatory. They instituted a range of interfaces for claim making and oversight as part of the new welfare architecture, such as social audits, local authorities to redress citizens' complaints, village monitoring committees, digital portals for disclosure of program records, and so on. The decentralization reforms of the 1990s, of which Yamini has done a lot of work, is the institutional backbone on which much of these reforms rest. Now, this was followed by a second wave of legislations and reforms, which is the bottom half of the timeline, which was introduced by various subnational governments, such as the right to public service laws. And together, these national and subnational legislations have created a new set of legal and institutional avenues for ordinary citizens to demand public services and to seek accountability. Next, please. So the formal claim-making terrain is much more crowded now. Social audits, an exercise in which the state arrives at the doorstep of citizens to verify the performance of public programs and register claims, is conducted in about half of 250,000 panchayats across the country every year. Next, please. This figure varies over years and across states. For instance, 40% of panchayats were audited in 2018 and 70% in 2022. And this figure there's a little bit of a dip in this figure because of the COVID years, and it hovers around 70% in 2024 as well. Next, please. All except 6 states have right to public service laws with online and offline modes of access. Next, please. In 2009, only 1 state had a right to public service law, but as you can see with the map on the right, most states in the country now have a right to public service instituted. There has been a proliferation of online grievance redress portals, public data portals, toll-free numbers which seek to make government responsive to citizens' demands and needs, each one with a name that tries to outdo the democratic credentials of the other. So for those of you who speak Hindi, these are actually quite colorful. So from Sampark in Rajasthan, which means contact, to Aple Sarkar in Maharashtra, which means your government, to Jan Sunani in Orissa, again, listening to the voice of people. These systems are getting significant attention from bureaucrats and political leaders, absorbing a great deal of administrative energy and resources. But it was really cases like Buddhinath Jha's that I'm going to talk to you about a little bit that led me to look at claim-making practices and forums more closely. And so Buddhinath Jha was 23 years old. He was a regular user of the right to information law, and he also dabbled in journalism. He was from a middle-income upper caste family in Bihar. His father was a contractual employee with the state's transport department, and his brother worked as a bus driver and conductor. He studied in the government school in his village and then got a college degree. He was preparing to apply for another college degree in science at the time that he was killed. He was active in the local student union, where along with his studies and activism, he also worked part-time with a local private clinic. It's this experience which gave him an insider's view of the malpractices within, such as overcharging of patients, doctors with fake degrees, and so on. So after extracting information using the right to information law, he decided to use Bihar's recently introduced grievance redress law to take on the medical mafia, as this article quotes. So Buddhinath had filed complaints against several unlicensed private clinics which were operating in the district of Madhubani in northern Bihar, where several hearings had taken place for the 3 complaints that he had filed at different times between 2020 and 21. And the grievance redress officer who was hearing his complaint had ordered action against some of the 19 private clinics that he had mentioned in his complaint. Some of these clinics were actually shut down. Some were fined about $300, which is not a lot, but it was still action that was taken. Now, many had tried to dissuade Buddhinath Jha from pursuing this case, but he had soldiered on. And his brother, who I interviewed, said Buddhinath had become very stubborn. He was determined not to let fake clinics operate. And midway through the hearings on the 3rd complaint, Buddhinath Jha went missing. 2 days later, his body was found. He had been strangled, and his body had been tossed into a field. The hearing for his last and final complaint concluded with an order that quite callously stated the case is closed because the complainant was not present to clarify the details. So Buddinath Jha's case is really tragic and disturbing and demonstrates how threatening claim-making forums like these can be to vested interests. And although illegal clinics that were fleecing poor families were brought under public scrutiny through the hearings, the response of the state has been far from adequate. Not only has the state failed to take serious action, but it also failed to protect Buddinath Jha's life. So while a case like Buddinath Jha should discourage other complainants, this has not been the case. Next, please. So as the institutional surface area of the state, as our friend and fellow sociologist, Patrick Heller, often uses the term, as the institutional surface area of the local state increased through these various formal forums for claim making, so has the volume of claim making. So for example, the right to information law, which is currently under serious threat, remains one of the most widely used freedom of information laws in the world, with 6 million requests filed annually. Since the grievance redress law that I just referred to was introduced in the state of Bihar, Buddinath Jha's home state, an average of about 150,000 complaints are filed every year. On average, 100 people attend a social audit public hearing. So in Bihar, again, where more than 70% of panchayats were audited last year, approximately 450,000 people participated in hearings across the state, to just give you a sense of, what is the scale of this, the scale and volume of claim making in the country. Next, please. So most of these new legal mechanisms for claim making have been put in place at the local level, but we know little about how these are working. So the focus of the legal mobilization and claim-making scholarship in the global south, and particularly in South Asia, is clustered at two ends. The social legal literature predominantly focuses on pleas to courts, and scholarship that looks at local claim-making practices focuses quite overwhelmingly on the role of informal institutions such as brokers or party workers. What we do know from the scholarship on the local state in India is that it is generally rent-seeking, overburdened, largely dysfunctional, and allergic to transparency. We also know that the conditions for seeking information, asking questions, and making claims on the state has historically been extremely hostile and demanded extreme obsequiousness from citizens. Next, please. Citizen claim making at the local level primarily takes place through three routes, all of which are informal. So citizen claim making at the local level can first takes place through elected officials or politicians, and has for long been understood through the lens of clientelism. More recent work, however, on distributive politics in India challenges the idea of voters as passive recipients and shows how citizens are actively and creatively using claim-making strategies to intermediaries or brokers who use their personal connections to local officials to get their clients access to a range of public services. Again, recent work has shown that there is a leveling of brokerage networks, which is increasing the bargaining power of citizens who can now make more demands. And the third mode of access is directly approaching appointed officials or bureaucrats. Again, in the absence of any formal interfaces or legal frameworks in the past, encounters between citizens and state officials over these welfare-based claims had historically been quite ad hoc, and responses had also been largely discretionary. Next, please. So both sets of studies, whether focusing on claim making from above or below, highlight factors such as legal knowledge, exposure to legal systems, social status and citizen capacities, kinship and neighborhood networks, and organizational connections to explain who claims and when, who makes claims and when they are made. However, Gabby Crooks-Wisner, whose book this is, herself argues that claim making is not only socially produced, but also state-induced, where the state's uneven rights terrain and variability in social provisioning creates a sense of aggrievement, and therefore prompts action. I build on this to argue that variation in the institutionalization of rights alone is not an adequate catalyst for claim making. And it's this survey of the scholarship that led me to ask, next slide, please, how are legally backed forums for democratic accountability embedded in centralized and opaque bureaucracies on one hand, And second, why does rights-based claim making through these formal forums emerge in deeply unequal contexts where there is this high level of disenchantment with the state, or where we would expect a high level of disenchantment with the state? I situate my research in Bihar as a least likely and surprising case. For lack of time, I won't get into the case selection, but I'm happy to answer any questions you might have in the Q&A. In Bihar, I look at two distinct but complementary legally backed platforms for claim making. They have different political origins, but open up the state through similar logics by bringing the local state and citizens into a deliberative encounter where state and traditional social power can be challenged. Social audits are people-led assessments of public services and governance, and I briefly describe them in the column on the left. But I'm going to focus on the second, which is the grievance redress law in Bihar, which is a decentralized system through which citizens can file grievances across government departments. Under the law, citizens have a right to a hearing by an independent adjudicating officer, where they can also contest the claims of implementing officials and have their grievances redressed within fixed timelines. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on the latter, but would be happy to talk more about the social audits case in Q&A. Now, fieldwork for this project was conducted between 2019 and 21 in 6 districts, but I continue to do this work and spend some time in Bihar looking at these questions again in 2024. Next, please. To be able to answer my research questions and really unpack how power, law, and institutions interact, I use broadly 3 methods: participant observation. I draw on 70 hours of observation over 25 hearings and 18-week-long social audit cycles. Second, 80 semi-structured in-depth interviews with bureaucrats, grievance redress officials, social auditors. The next slide, please. Ward members, elected officials, activists, lawyers, and so on. Next, please. Third, I conduct document analysis where I analyze the text of these written complaints that were filed under the law, as well as affidavits that were filed during the process of social audits. Next, please. So again, Bihar is the only state in the country to have introduced a legal right to redress that I argue in this chapter has expanded the infrastructural power of the state. It's invited new challenges to its legitimacy and opened up the local state to the possibility of democratization. It's also a state where accessing legal accountability, as I've shown with Budinath Jha's case, comes at an extremely heavy cost. And Bihar also has an unfortunate record of being a state with one of the highest numbers of murders of right to information users, 25 since 2005 when the law was introduced. Next, please. I now trace the making of the grievance redress law in Bihar over 2 phases. The first phase is from charismatic to bureaucratic redress. So who you see on the left is the Chief Minister of Bihar, continues to be the Chief Minister of Bihar. When he came to power in 2005, this is Nitish Kumar, his development and good governance agenda, or Sushasan agenda, was quite carefully crafted to serve as a sharp contrast to his predecessor, Lalu Yadav, who had led a movement that gave backward castes in the state dignity, but many have shown has failed to deliver on development. So he conducted these high visibility yatras or journeys across the state, as the picture on the left shows, and the spectacle of weekly Janta Darbars or people's courts, which you see on the right, which became the cornerstones of his political legacy in his first 2 terms in office and continues to define his political legacy even today. The popularity of these people's courts rests on the belief that only complaints filed at the highest levels outside of the web of local power brokers and structures will be given a fair hearing. Once grievances were registered in this process at the Chief Minister's residence, they were sent to various departments who would pass these downwards to the district, which is at the below the level of the state, who would then push them further down to the block level, which broadly corresponds to a county. Between 2006 and 2012, 450,000 such grievances had been filed across the state, but the system for collecting, hearing, and resolving people's claims and complaints was still highly personalized. So many claims remain unresolved or partially resolved for years. There was no citizen oversight or participation in the redress process. In many cases, grievances often went back to the same bureaucrat for resolution that had denied the entitlement in the first place. And while higher level bureaucrats who are directly answerable to the chief minister were compelled to publicly align their perceptions on the value of resolving citizens' grievances, lower level bureaucrats were much more vocal in their disgruntlement. So as you can see in the quotes on the slide, these officers would say things like, people have made filing complaints a profession. We need to keep a full record of the complainant. They have a political agenda. Complaints are only filed to pressurize officers, and so on. And then the final one, we cannot resolve 80% of the complaints that come to us. There just isn't enough evidence. So it's a different kinds of disgruntlement that was expressed by these officials. Okay, over the next few years, several subtle but transformative changes were made in the way citizens' claims were handled that I see as a process of building legal consciousness within the bureaucracy. So first, one of the early steps that were taken towards changing the view of the lower bureaucracy that grievances lacked specificity and therefore did not merit attention was to actually lay down clearer terms for the articulation of the grievance itself and how it would be categorized. Second, another reform was changing how the grievances would be processed. This was done by making the local bureaucrat and not citizens responsible for converting all grievances to rule-based, irrespective of how they were articulated. And third, separating the facts which had to be investigated from the grievance itself. Now in phase 2, these darbars or these people's courts were replaced with a legal right to redress. So the law that was introduced in Bihar in 2015 gave citizens' claims further legitimacy and made what were previously just quotidian acts of claim making justiciable. The law covers all 44 departments and nearly 500 services in the state, from land to social welfare to the functioning of police stations. So it's exhaustive and comprehensive. The law completely decentralizes the procedures through which citizens can make claims. So while people's courts have not been entirely dismantled, they have been supplemented by what are called khidkis or windows in every district and subdivision across the state. So you see an image of that window on your screen. And the most significant new feature of this law is individual hearings, where for the first time, citizens and bureaucrats were brought face to face before an independent authority. Now I shift to the second part of the story, which is the law in practice. So while the law sets the terms of what is legally grievable, I find that pathways to receptivity and ultimately redress are constructed during the claim-making encounter when legal categories interact with what Bernardo Zacca calls informal taxonomies of the complaint and the complainant, and the professional identities of the grievance redress officer and the testifying bureaucrat, who's the implementing official. I go beyond the completeness of the resolution or the recorded satisfaction of the complainant and look for other outcomes of the hearing process. So for instance, I look at whether evidence and testimonies of the complainant challenges the power of the local state and dominant elites, whether hearings unsettle the local political settlement, how these claim-making encounters shape the perceptions and everyday practices of bureaucrats, who participates in these hearings, and so on. So participation in the hearings alone, I acknowledge, will not change bureaucratic practices, but I do analyze whether the ritualization, but I do ask whether the ritualization of hearings in which some form of procedural justice is performed has had any effect on the norms and culture of the local state. After the law was introduced, about 120 mid-level bureaucrats were appointed as grievance redress officers. So while they share strong ties with the testifying bureaucrat or the implementing official, they also expressed a range of commitment levels to upholding the law or performing fairness. So some viewed their role as that of a safety valve between people and the state. Some described their roles more outrightly as a people's representative. And then there were some grievance redress officers who were more cynical and viewed these new forums as political and had very strong views on the pressures that the lower bureaucracy now has to face with this barrage of complaints that are and claims that are being filed through these platforms. One grievance redress officer summed it up quite helpfully. He says, in 30% of the cases, I am with the system. And in 70% of the cases, I am with the public, to give you a sense of the range of professional identities that I observed. Next, please. The trajectory and outcome of the hearing is also shaped by the way the testifying bureaucrat, typically a welfare officer, views the law. So a common refrain of welfare bureaucrats was that the multiplicity of accountability mechanisms introduced in the last 15 years has stretched them thin. So this particular officer says, how has the grievance redress law strengthened our capacity? It is like giving us a small bow and arrow and sending us to the battlefield of the Mahabharata, which is the great Indian epic. Some felt that even as the pressure of responding to claims has increased, the complainant had also been disciplined and did not bring unsubstantiated claims to the bureaucracy anymore. And this made them more amenable to the redress process. Then there were several bureaucrats who acknowledged that obfuscating by hiding a claim inside a file, which in Hindi would be tal matol ki niti, and ambiguity has been weakening, and that obfuscation has become more difficult. So both grievance redress officers and the testifying bureaucrats use similar informal taxonomies to classify complaints and complainants. They distinguish between political complainants and genuine complainants. Political complainants are generally seen as those who have social and political clout. These complainants are typically landed and upper caste. Political complainants also are also identified by the frequency with which they file complaints. So as we see in this quote, this particular welfare officer says, this is a litigious district. It is a Yadav-dominated district so Yadavs are again classified as other backward classes. They're not upper caste, but they have become politically quite, they have gained political power in the last 2 to 3 decades. So this person says it is a Yadav-dominated district where everyone is a politician. This is why we have the highest number of complaints filed in the state. All that these people know how to do is to infiltrate the state and provoke matters. Yadavs are a part of the other backward caste category. Yeah, sorry, I explained that already. Okay. So some political complainants are also seen as Samaj Sevis, or people serving the community. They are often local journalists, seasoned right to information activists, or youth leaders of political parties. Local elected leaders at the bottommost rung of the panchayat structure, known as ward members, are also frequent users of this claim-making forum. Conversely, poorer, less educated complainants, particularly from Dalit and backward caste communities, and women tended to be viewed as more genuine. I find that the frame of the genuine complainant has been broadly shaped by how welfare programs have defined the deserving or those in need. Those who are directly eligible and bring welfare-based claims are generally considered genuine, as opposed to those who have filed welfare-related claims on behalf of a group or of which they may or may not have been members. In some instances, the categories of political and genuine complainants would be trumped by the substance of the matter and whether the claim is public-spirited, such as the poor material used for a drain construction, or particularistic, such as a land encroachment issue. Finally, there are some claims which simply test the legal limits of what can be reasonably addressed through the grievance redress forum. So again, a welfare official remarks, some issues just cannot be resolved under this law, like land. Other than revenue, we're able to resolve a lot of complaints where we know that the implementation issues are at the block level. When we build pressure on the block level and send notices, we're unable to get a solution out. So I categorize the varieties of redress along 2 axes. Resolution, which is when a complaint has been closed after action has been taken, and disruption, when the hearing and the resolution unsettles the local political settlement, and one certainly does not follow the other. So there are a combination of outcomes that I observed. So in the first type of hearing, claims are not fulfilled. Complaints remain unresolved, and the opaque exclusionary practices of the state are not challenged. Prevailing bureaucratic norms and practices persist, and the likelihood of citizens engaging in further claim making is lowered. This type of hearing does not open up a space for narratives of claimants to be expressed and for contestation and dialogue to take place. So I call this no resolution, no disruption. In this case, grievance redress officers do not view their role as adjudicatory or see the law itself as detrimental to bureaucratic authority, which then aligns with the testifying bureaucrat. These are hearings where claimants' narratives and evidence are most likely to be suppressed or simply dismissed. Claims and complaints are closed on very flimsy grounds without any concrete resolution and demands for any kind of explanation from local officials. This is probably what we would expect from every hearing under this law, particularly in a state like Bihar. But contrary to that expectation, there are two other kinds of outcomes of redress that I encountered. So in the second type of hearing, there is both resolution and disruption. So in this case, this is the case of a young man from an upper caste family with connections to the youth wing of a political party who brought a complaint about a poor quality of a drinking water pipeline in his village. And he brought it to this particular forum. And even though the grievance redress officer had a cynical view of politically connected complainants, she focused on the substantive details of the complaint during the hearing. Now, a lack of assertiveness by the testifying bureaucrat and weak evidence of action, in contrast to the bundle of evidence provided by the complainant who had walked in with 2 or 3 bags of paperwork, pushed the hearing in a favorable direction. So here, the genuineness of the case trumped the motives of the political complainant. So this was a case where a complaint was resolved in favor of public interest and challenged the local political settlement. Previous attempts at raising the issue had led to confrontations with a nexus of village elites and threats of violence. By seeking adjudication through the formal forum of the grievance redress hearings, Amit, which is this person's name, escalated the complaint to one level above the local political structure, thereby bypassing it. So cognizant of the need to diffuse the power of the local nexus over welfare distribution, the grievance redress officer calls for an independent inquiry by the local bureaucrat. So this was the case where there was both resolution and the local political settlement was disrupted. The third is a case of disruption without resolution. So disruptions occurred in varied ways and sometimes took extreme forms, such as the case of Budhinath Jha, where the nexus between district medical officers and business interests of private hospitals and clinics was exposed and destabilized, even though the complaint was never fully resolved and Budhinath paid with his life. In less extreme cases, implementing authorities emphasize somewhat grudgingly how the time limit within which citizens' claims and complaints have to be answered has made them modify their routines, such as filing reports more regularly, visiting the field at the behest of citizens' claims and complaints, in addition to their routine administrative inspections. Okay, so to summarize, as in the case of grievance redress hearings, which I just discussed, which create these divergent pathways for responsiveness, in the larger project, I unpack how the local state can be democratized through carefully designed processes that ritualize deliberation and contestation between citizens and officials in rule-based settings. So first, I argue that legalistic and deliberative modes of governance have often been viewed as contradictory. So for example, if we look at Akshay Mangala's work on making bureaucracy work, I argue that the two work together. So additional legal frameworks for accountability are typically seen as only increasing the compliance burden on the bureaucracy. However, I build on Charles Epps' work, who argues that and I argue that in an institutional context like India, the law continues to be a powerful and even subversive medium through which civic norms such as deliberation, fairness, transparency, and dignity can be standardized and infused in state practices. So while the legitimating symbols and procedures of court-like proceedings, as you would have seen in the photograph of the chair with the towel in the back and the plaques in front, these are like various kinds of symbols, court-like symbols are used in these grievance redress hearings. And many may consider this merely performative. I emphasize that process values can make decision-making and adjudication more service-oriented, as we saw in one of the cases. Second, iterative embedding of civic ethos and a Weberian bureaucratic ethos is key. So introducing a law is one thing, but building a normative commitment is quite another. I argue that building this normative commitment requires a cyclical embedding of these two types of ethos. This is done through both internal mechanisms such as rules, training, selective recruitment, as we saw with the hand-selected 120 grievance redress officers, but also through repeated deliberative interactions with citizens through hearings and other rule-based settings. So while, again, much of the legal consciousness literature, for example, has focused on marginalized citizens, and rightfully so, I emphasize the importance of building the legal consciousness of state actors and show how that was done in the case of Bihar. And finally, by participating in hearings, I show how claimants learn about the criteria and parameters for decision-making. It gives claimants participation in these forums, gives claimants access to evidence produced by officials and an opportunity to scrutinize and invoke an appeals process, which then incentivizes further claim making. So even when the forum of the hearing is used by politically connected complainants or what the scholarship calls repeat players, it can challenge deep-rooted networks of power. Evidence of these disruptions can often be found in the backlash that it creates, which in extreme cases can even be murder. So with that kind of grim end, but with hopefully what you see as several silver linings, I'll end here and invite and look forward to Yamini's comments. Thank you.
Fantastic. Yamini, are you with us? Able to provide some comments before we go to Q&A?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. This is a really sort of a momentous occasion for me in that I have known Anindita for a very long time, from her early days as an activist when we were going to when we spent some time together cutting our teeth in rural parts of Madhya Pradesh, trying to mobilize parent-teacher associations to make school development plans, to her as she evolved into this formidable scholar who has produced such an excellent dissertation. So I'm really excited both to see how much Anindita's work has evolved, but also to have a chance to engage with it in a more meaningful way. So thank you, Oni. It's a real privilege to be here and to have a chance to talk with you in a more formal setting about your work as it has evolved. I think I have only about 7 minutes, so I'm going to try and engage with this really from a broader perspective of why I think work like this is so important, and the contribution it makes, I think, to an issue, to a concern that all democracies are struggling with today, which is that of how do we frame the contours of how to talk about the state. To my understanding, and both looking at the evolution of the debates on state capacity in India and the transformation of what was a progressive democratic enterprise into a democratic backsliding semi-authoritarian enterprise, and then observing what is happening in the US as well, that one part of the explanation or one part of what we need to understand about why countries that were on a democratic path find themselves in this moment of backsliding and stress has to do with how we've engaged with the state. And I think broadly from, these are two very different countries, two very different contexts, and two very different worlds in which the same sense of disenchantment has arisen. So I'm not trying to make comparisons of that nature. But I want to say that I think the frameworks that we have deployed through which to understand state failure have led to a common kind of sense of disenchantment. And the frameworks that we have applied to understand why state has failed have actually contributed to the problem rather than helped address it, by which I mean, we have always looked to the state and to efforts to try and quote unquote reform the state or make the state work from the point of view of its efficiency, return on investment of efficiency. And that has been, from the days of I just came across Elizabeth Brandman's fabulous book on thinking like an economist that traces the genealogy of efficiency in the context of the US, but I'll speak more to this in the context of India, where the inability of the state to do very basic things like deliver core public services to its citizens consistently got us caught in this discourse on trying to find ways to make the state more efficient so that delivery to citizens can actually, so we can observe outcomes. And in that discourse on efficiency, we've both sought to get rid of the state. So in the framework of new public management, seeking to shrink the state, bring in private sector tools to make the state, quote unquote, more efficient, privatization of parts of the state. And when all of those tools fail, we seek to bypass the state, and technology offered this magic bullet solution in the form of direct benefit transfers and other mechanisms that essentially sought to bypass the state altogether in the hope that by exiting the intermediaries of the state, all these actors that Anindita's work speaks about, we will in fact be able to get a state that efficiently delivers. And in the process of that efficient delivery, the trade-off that we make to some degree is the trade-off of public participation in the democratic processes of the state and claim making. But it's a trade-off worth making because the costs of participation are high. And therefore, if we have a more efficient state, we'll indeed get a state that delivers well. What we never discussed was the consequences of the trade-off of democracy and how that stokes the authoritarian, the authoritarian within the democratic context. And that really is a reality that India is staring at today. And I think what Oni's work really highlights to us is that if you step away from the efficiency question, so if you look at social audits and grievance redressal, and I must say, mea culpa, I too, in my early investigations on both these topics, was trying to understand the kind of efficiency, return on investment, what does this actually do to the quality of service delivery, then you may well come away quite disappointed, because overall, even if you look at Oni's data on the kind of complaints and the nature of the redressal, the completion of the redressal, etc., it doesn't look as satisfactory. And you would ask yourself, there is something wrong with the state itself that you need to put in this grievance redressal system in the first place. And even that doesn't work because there's something so deeply wrong with the state. From an efficiency point of view, this may not be as much of a success as we want. And so we want to get rid of the state as much as possible, because if you deliver cash instead of anything, rather than get the citizen to engage with the state or deliver through investments in public systems, which are all broken, the cash may actually reach the citizen, and then it is for the citizen to do whatever she wants to with the cash, and we have markets for that. But actually looking at Oni's work tells us so much about what the process, when you step away from the efficiency framework and actually try and understand processes, you learn about how encounters with the state through these legal entitlements, and I think of grievance redressal laws as part of that parcel of legal entitlements, do to both build the democratic norms of engagement, and in that sense strengthen the state itself, but also, as Oni so importantly describes, brings the citizen encounters vis-a-vis the state are actually a very important contribution to shaping the democratic norms within the state itself, which is something that in my own work, when I've tried to delve deep inside the state, I've actually missed. I kind of bracketed society because I wanted to understand the internal workings of the state, which I saw as a very critical element that we need to better understand, and the structure of power and the dynamics of power and the kind of cultural organizational culture that creates within the state as being one of the elements that we need to understand better. But what I never thought of as deeply as I did when I encountered Oni's work and listening to her presentation today too, was how much the consistent presence of the citizen, every time the citizen comes to stake claims on the state, it also, it's a dynamic process. It also shapes how the state starts viewing the citizen and its own role. And I think that it's in the interstices of this dynamic that is created that we can actually actually begin to understand the depths of the norm-making shifts that the state actually makes in order for it to deliver better to citizens. When we think only about efficiency, we miss on these complex layers of what it takes to change systems, and what it takes to change systems, particularly in ways that strengthen the democratic ideal of the state-citizen dynamic, which is the ideal towards which we move. And in our discourse, therefore, we end up missing this very critical nuance and seek solutions that seek to get rid of the state, or seek to bypass the processes that make the state work better, by using mechanisms like technology to leapfrog all of these processes altogether. So to circle back, I think one of the most important contributions, Oni, that you're making is, in a sense, reminding us that process is not evil. Process is not the evil that you need to get rid of. Of course, you don't want unnecessary process that gives you the waste, fraud, incompetence, corruption, that Doge, etc., wanting to try and are sort of hiding their larger anti-democratic project within in claims of efficiency. But process actually is critical to building democratic norms of engagement between the state and citizen. And we need to identify those processes. We need to study those processes to strengthen them in ways that enable this dynamic interaction between citizen and state. And that means that and the other bit of this that we tend to forget, especially in this kind of techno utopia that all of us that is now the framework in which we debate the state across the globe. It's not just an Indian framework. That actually space matters. The physicality of space matters. To me, what is really important is through these laws, there's a physical space, a complaint window, a set of processes where the citizen and the frontline bureaucrat are physically interacting with each other. It's not behind a server. It's not behind a management information system. It is a physical interaction. And sure, 9 out of 10 times the window might be closed, but on the 10th time when that window is open and there are two individuals, those encounters are really, really crucial to shaping the nature of the state and how the state develops its own understanding of the citizens that they are meant to serve. And so it is very important to remember that in this techno-utopian server state that we are building, that we are losing those physical encounters. And ultimately, if the state is meant to genuinely serve citizens in ways that are democratic and where we seek democratic outcomes, that physicality needs to be held on to. So again, just the descriptions of your encounters to me, and the detailing of your ethnographic observations are extremely important, not just for the analytical contribution, but also for the reminder that they offer us on why it's so important for the physical interrelationship between the state and the citizen to continue within a framework where the state is at least to some degree empowered to respond. One of the challenges I'm beginning to see with the kind of server state is that it's not that the state has disappeared. The panchayat officer is still there. The physical building of the panchayat is still there. The block office is still there. It is that it has taken away even the small eminence of power that frontline bureaucrats used to have in order to be able to respond to grievances by placing it in a centralized server that's extremely far away from where the physical encounters between the state and citizen is. And I think that your work is a very, very important reminder of why that physicality is so crucial to strengthening the state and ensuring that it in fact delivers in ways where efficiency will be obtained, where efficiency is a means and not the end of the state itself. So thanks a lot. This work is really fascinating and has opened my eyes to many new ways of thinking about old questions. So thanks a lot, Oni.
Well, fantastic. I mean, presentation, a fantastic set of comments, just to get things rolling. So between Yamini's excellent comments and also you've got some really, seemed like some very great questions in the Q&A, which I think you can see, Ani, if you click on those. So I'm going to kind of just hand it over to you for starters and let you kind of take a look at those and think about what among Yamini's comments you want to respond to as well. I think that's a lot to work with. And then people should still feel free to add more questions in the Q&A function. So.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Yamini. It's always nice sometimes to actually have this conversation with someone who's seen the work evolve, but more than anything, you've been a witness to these changes over these reforms in a way over the last 2 decades. And the way we viewed these reforms over the years has also changed. And as has as has democracy and the way we understand it itself, right? So I do the larger project that you identified is really a question on the difference, and I say this, I've said this before, between the kind of big D democracy and the small d democracy, and while much of our focus has been on these bigger kind of institutional independent institutions and oversight bodies, what does everyday claim making and oversight look like, and what are the bottom up ways in which the democratization of the state then contributes? Does it have any kind of upward effects? And these are things that the paper somewhat alludes to. These are not fully not arrived at full conclusions, but this is ongoing work where I want to close the loop, where I want to be able to go back and follow up on these cases that have been filed, both through a collective platform of social audits, which is the other case, and the individual platforms of the grievance redress hearings, to see how do these two accountability reforms, one that was introduced through kind of bureaucratic and political elites, which is the case that I discussed today, and the other which came through more popular mobilization, and how these two kind of come together in a compact, in a way, to seal in some ways procedures of deliberation, transparency, and accountability, and then now we're really being able to observe the effects that it is or is not having on the bureaucracy that stands kind of the test of political regimes that will come and go. So that's kind of which the larger project will also have to contend with that. But thank you so much for, I think, your more than questions. I think you've extended a lot of the arguments that I'm making in this particular chapter and the overall project. So thank you so much for that. And there are some really good questions here as well. So I'll take a go at answering a couple of them. So the first one is about the first question is regarding the RTI Act. To what extent is it a catalyst for the Aadhaar-driven top-down transparency thrust upon citizens by the Indian state? Again, the relationship between the right to information, there is kind of the sunlight being the best disinfectant approach versus a biometric identification system. These are two very, very different approaches to thinking about accountability. They have very different political histories in terms of the reforms themselves, the legislation themselves, how they were introduced. So to me, the relationship between the two are actually, the two are, similar arguments may be used for transparency through legislation like the RTI and Aadhaar doing the same work of making welfare programs more transparent or accountable. But to me, these are two completely distinct ways of thinking about accountability in the delivery of welfare. So I don't see one as the catalyst of the other at all. In terms of who the actors that drove our right to service laws in India, and why did the right to service laws not expand at the central level? So again, interestingly, unlike the various legislations that were introduced at the national level, like the right to information, the National Rural Employment Guarantee, the Forest Rights Act, and others, the right to service laws were actually largely introduced at the subnational level without any popular demand or mobilization. These were largely introduced by the bureaucracy or the political leadership of the time, and these were largely responding to the good governance kind of agenda that has diffused really internationally and globally. And so whether it's the World Bank report, the short and long route to accountability, which changed the way that we think about public service delivery, or particularly practitioners within government think about public service delivery. And there were kind of similar reforms in other parts of the world, but these were several scholars have also argued these were led by, these were also promoted by various international organizations and international development organizations that were focused on a bureaucratic, that took a business re-engineering approach to thinking about governance and the bureaucracy. So the right to service laws didn't really come from this kind of bottom-up demand or pressure in the way that social audits or the RTI or these other legislations did. What are the key design-based aspects of the UPA's rights-based laws that alienated the bureaucracy? Again, I don't know. I don't know if it has alienated the bureaucracy. I think it's alienated. It's sort of public opinion. This is a question about public opinion rather than an empirical question about whether the bureaucracy has really been alienated by the UPA's legislations. Prominently, let's take the example of the NREGA, which has stood the test of time in a way and has survived a change in political regimes which threatened the legacy and the future of a program that was considered the cornerstone of the UPA's, the United Progressive Alliance's rights-based legislative frameworks that it introduced. So in a sense, the bureaucracy, if anything, at the most local level has been reoriented. The capacity of the local bureaucracy has been enhanced as a result of these legislations that were introduced. So the embeddedness of the bureaucracy in the design of these programs itself is now so deep and so intertwined that I think the question of alienation is one that is perhaps moot. The next question is about the overall impact of creating such a system on top of bureaucracy that is often described as overloaded. Do you see a risk of introducing such procedures potentially leading to a decline in service quality or replacement of effort in order to cater to demands or through such systems? Sorry, I'm just reading this out so that everyone has a sense of what the question is. I see the political incentives of appearing as standing by citizens against the state, lazy and unaccountable bureaucrats, but might this possibly be a cheap exit from the accountability by politicians instead of investing in state infrastructure and capacity? So this is often, I do cite this as an often quoted critique of these accountability reforms, and this, bureaucrats, for the number of bureaucrats who describe their situation as entering that battlefield of war with a little bow and arrow, that's again quite prevalent amongst lower level bureaucrats who certainly do feel like they're not only is the system largely been created to hold the lowest and the most vulnerable in a way within the system accountable, but if we view it as strictly from this perspective of capacity, it would seem that the local state is being weakened to the detriment of implementation of welfare programs because of these new obligations to respond to citizens' claims. But the loss of control and increased bureaucratic load at the local welfare office as a result of increased public scrutiny is also changing local bureaucratic practices. And I only alluded to that with a few quotes that I was able to share in this presentation. But how bureaucrats manage their time, how bureaucrats, for example, have to show up once a week for their respective hearings. And this is also a time when they get a lot of work done, when they go to the district office to resolve claims and complaints that they are dealing with in any case at their block offices. So there are ways in which they do manage their schedules and their time. And it is also an overstated kind of, complaint in a way that bureaucrats do have, that this is nothing but an added layer at the cost of provide. And it's not a zero-sum game. It's not the accountability systems that you're putting in place are not substituting, enhancing, whether it's resources or whether it's physical infrastructure, whether it's more people. So it's not, one doesn't come at the cost of the other. The two, it really isn't, it isn't an either or option. So what this also does is that it highlights for political leadership and bureaucrats, higher level bureaucrats, what those capacity constraints might also be. And that's when the grievance redress reports are reviewed at the highest levels. Those are some of the questions and considerations that higher level bureaucracy regularly engages with. And it's not just the bureaucracy. These are questions that these are reports and questions that are also brought up and addressed in legislative assemblies and other kind of and other forums. So I don't know if that answered your question. Okay, I see another question from Patrick. I'm curious if you see popular claim making in India as not always deepening local good governance. Have deliberative engagements with the bureaucracy also given muscle to exclusionary or indeed authoritarian ends? So absolutely. And I do refer to cases where we see no disruption, no resolution. And that was the case that we would most expect in a state, particularly a state like Bihar, which is amongst various things is also notorious for extremely entrenched caste inequalities and structures. A lot of the scholarship on brokers and intermediaries and strongmen and patronage networks has come out of studies that have actually looked at governance and service delivery in a state like Bihar. So yes, that is one kind of case that I encountered. Cases where these forums do nothing really to disrupt local political settlements, where grievance redress officers, irrespective of the kind of hearing process or practice that they follow, very little changes on the outside, or the process that the grievance redress officer directs is either captured, co-opted, disrupted, derailed. There are extreme cases of course, backlash, as I shared in the case of Budina Jha. So it absolutely does it can reproduce and perpetuate exclusionary and extremely hierarchical modes of both control, power, and access to the state, as has historically been the case. But the focus of the presentation and the paper and the larger project is that in addition to that, the case that we most expect, there are these two other kinds of outcomes that we also see that are significant and important to consider in the story of a very difficult story of democratizing a state that has been that has largely been associated with historic failure and high levels of disenchantment amongst ordinary citizens. So that's kind of the emphasis.
So I want to give you a chance to breathe, first of all. I didn't realize a drawback of having to read the questions. Usually when you hear the questions, you can take a breath and rest for a minute. So the fact that you have to read the questions, so take a breath. That's an amazing amount of material you've gone through. But I'd like to interject with one thought, which is really driven by Yamini's comments, but also Patrick's question, and get us to pan back out a little bit to the broader picture and think about like our moment in the world in terms of democracy and the threats to it, and how we defend democracy, how we protect democracy when it's under assault in the United States now in ways that very much mirror things that happened in India, as well. And I think one thing I've always loved about your work in particular is that it just forces you to think about democracy in a very material way. So as opposed to kind of procedural understandings of elections and the like. So just what it means to have this democratic practice in Bihar, and the stories that you tell to me are just these utterly material stories. So that really gives a kind of life and a blood to the topic that I think is really lacking in most work. But it also really struck me as I was listening today, because I've been thinking about this a lot in the American context, like what does it mean to resist, and what does it mean to resist in an effective way? And I think there's a lot of discourse right now about, well, what's going to work? What kind of resistance works? What kind of dissidence? What kind of disobedience? What kind of political practices? What kind of participation will work? And as you were going back and forth with Yamini about efficiency and the results, the outcomes don't always look great, but there's something about the process, and that the process is sort of the thing itself. So in a way, what your work I think is sort of inviting us to do is not so much to ask, will this kind of democratic action work, but to see that democratic action is the work, that is kind of what the actual content of what democracy is. And so whether or not we live in democratic conditions in the next 5, 10, 15 years in a lot of these places in the world depends on what we do, not only on the outcomes of what we do, but the actions itself. And I guess I just wonder, does that resonate with you? Do you feel like when you think about the way that citizens in Bihar engage with the state and kind of enact their democratic rights, that regardless of how it's received, regardless of whether it's ignored, there's something about the action itself, something about the process itself from the citizen side, which gives a kind of democratic content that can give us maybe some optimism and a little more agency in the moment where optimism and agency are very hard to come by?
Yeah, I think it does. And that's the argument that I am making, that process is either viewed through this sort of technocratic, this lens of how it's primarily, it's either serving bureaucracy or overburdening bureaucracy, or it's making life just more difficult for ordinary people to be able to access the state, their rights, make claims, etc. And I think, and that's, I think, precisely what I am trying to do with both the case of social audits and this one, and the grievance redress law, which is to say that process also works for people. So, for example, it builds a paper trail through which people are able, it incentivizes in repeated kind of claims on the state. Now, whether we should judge the sort of this activation of citizenship by the substance of the quality of the redress is something that I am asking us to step back from, and to look at what some of the other effects might be in terms of engaging in the political process, being who is accessing these forums has also changed over time. So it's not just repeat players or people who are well versed in the letter of the law. Yes, at these individualized forums, it is still predominantly men, or it is elected representatives who are actually using these forums. But interestingly, it's elected representatives who are not dominant caste elected representatives who are using these forums, for instance, to challenge how money is distributed by upper caste representatives who hold the purse strings in a way. So that's one example of how it's much more complex than kind of the procedure itself has tremendous potential to flip power, and that's what I'm trying to show through these kind of very granular cases.
Well, that seems like a more positive note than the talk ended on, that we could maybe propel us all forward into our various battles that we're all having across the world right now. But this is really just an amazing amount of material. It's just incredible field work, incredible analytical power you're bringing to this really challenging, amazing research. And I think Yamini's responses, I think, really underscored that as well. Yamini, did you want to step back in as well before we close out? I think you just unmuted. So
yes, just sort of in response to your point too about democratic action, I just wanted I think I just wanted to reiterate that there is this deep disenchantment with the idea of the state itself, that has fueled a lot of the kind of populist response to established norms, procedures, processes, mechanisms of the state. And I think what Oni kind of reminds us is there are ways to actually deploy process that strengthen the democratic relationship. So we need, as we are looking for answers, maybe we want to find answers in those parts of processes of the state. Maybe there are new processes that need to be infused, like these laws were new processes in some ways that relied on old tools. So one of my critiques of a lot of the rights laws was that we basically were relying on old tools of the state to perform a function for which they weren't really quote unquote fit to purpose. But by introducing those processes itself, you're pushing both empowering citizens to ask questions and also empowering the conversation. So what is it that you need to do to make the state more fit to purpose in ways that align with entitlements of citizens and that empower citizens to be claim makers, rather than saying, I want the state to be empowered to deliver because I want the state to look like Amazon.com. So I think that is that might be a helpful way of thinking about the relationship between democracy, state, procedures, processes. Those procedures, processes that we saw brought opacity and distance could also bring the citizen back into the state.
Terrific. So I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I think I'm delighted with how this whole conversation went. So I just want to thank everyone for attending. I want to thank Aiyar for running the traffic lights on all the technology. Thanks so much to Yamini Aiyar for her comments, and especially to Anindita Adhikari, who left us a year early to go take this job and to go back and rejoin the fight in India. Good for you. We miss you a lot. But it's been it's great to see what's coming of the work, and thanks for coming back and giving the talk. We're looking forward to seeing the book and all the related projects come together. So great to see you. Thanks everyone again for coming, and everyone stay safe and do your best out there. So have a great day.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Yamini.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rai. Thanks so much for organizing.